press one of those.
I just had to. Okay, welcome everyone. Guess who we have here? First voice. Just give your voice. Let's see if everyone can guess who you are.
No.
You're not going to even play along with that?
No,
it's
I don't
my
wanna play
show.
along
I could
with
kick
that.
you off of my show. Okay, then
I'm Danae's
introduce
husband,
yourself.
Philip.
The star of the show, Philip. Okay, number one.
This is Tori, Danae's sister.
This is my sister, and then my favorite brother-in-law
Hi,
today.
I'm Elliot. I'm the favorite brother-in-law.
For right now.
I'm Tori's husband.
For right now.
Well, he's here.
Oh.
Yeah.
So he is my current favorite. We're talking about a few things today. We want to talk about the 19th Amendment. We wanted to talk about blogging, parent blogging, and we might even bring up aliens. Who knows?
I
Whatever.
really hope it goes there.
You said you do hope, or
yeah,
you don't?
I do.
Probably the most exciting topic. Okay, first thing that I wanted to bring up was, yes, okay, let's go 19th Amendment. So there has been some circulation online about women voting. Should women vote or not? How did this all start, though? I think that I saw it from a YouTuber, 80 Robles. Did you listen to that, Phil, that episode?
I don't know.
Okay.
Maybe.
So he said something about like a lot of Christian women understand why there would be a movement or a contingent of people in Christian circles that would say the 19th Amendment was a bad idea. So do you guys think 19th Amendment was a bad idea? Yes or no?
I've postulated for years now that I think the 19th Amendment was a bad idea
Okay.
What is your reasoning for why?
because I think that you can trace a lot of subsequent horrible policies that have been put in place because of women being able to vote. I think you could also directly tie in Roe v. Wade to, giving women the right to vote. Yeah. I think it goes back even further than the 19th Amendment, though. I think it goes back to the Industrial Revolution. I think that's kind of where it all starts.
Okay. How so? Like, because women are in the
Because
workforce?
I think, for the first time you have, women largely working outside of the sphere of the home and now playing a different role in society where they're, doing jobs men would normally do, I guess. Well, not men per se, but I mean, you're taking them out of their traditional role as the homemaker, in the home, tending to, whatever a wife did prior to the Industrial Revolution, raise children. The cottage industry was largely, women, making clothes and just
Being more
To
domestic.
be clear, you're not talking about a view of women in the home that would be denigrating.
no,
You're
absolutely.
talking about very productive women who do lots of things. They're very busy.
Correct.
They add tremendous value to their household, and they were honored and respected for the work that they did.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think that's a role to be glorified, and it's a very tough role, I think, as any stay-at-home mom, I'm sure, can attest to now, like raising kids and tending to the home is it's a very noble job, and two, it's a very difficult job. So yeah, definitely not denigrating it at all.
So how is the Industrial Revolution associated with women's suffrage?
Because I think you, for the first time, see women now in roles that have given them quite a bit of freedom, I guess. They would, I would assume they would broken outside of the sphere of the home. They're, they're earning wages for the first time on their own. They're not dependent on, a husband.
I think like a modern argument for women voting would be because there's no difference between men and women. Why would you make a distinction? Or is it if you took, or maybe both, a second argument, could it be that if women didn't vote, men would just run their lives? And it would be bad for women. Like without women being able to vote, their lives would be terrible.
I also think that the sphere of politics really should belong to men. Yeah, it's easier for men to I think it's harder for women to take emotion out of it. Feel free to add to that if you want.
So what you led with, excuse me, what you led with was the reason you would oppose the 19th Amendment is because one of the reasons is because you see the fruit of it, that politically we're in places where voters have made bad decisions as a whole, and that's after women have been added into the voter rolls. I would not quite frame it that way. It's clear to me in looking at the Bible that God has created the world to run in a covenantal system, and covenants have heads, and the head mediates the covenant. So in a national covenant, there has to be a head that's mediating. And in an ideal world, you have a covenant head of a nation that recognizes his responsibility towards God. In the household, there's a covenant head. The husband is the head of his wife, the head of his children, and he bears responsibility for them. And that comes with the leadership that he exercises, not as a tyrant, but as a loving head. And so, in the same way that God has established men to be the heads of their households, what is a nation or a state or a city other than a collection of households? And so it makes sense that if God has so ordered the world that men should be the heads of their own households, then it should be the heads of households who band together to form a polis, to form a city, a group, and they would decide amongst themselves how they're going to be governed. And if you look at the forms of government that are discussed, political governments that are discussed in the Bible, you have the system of judges, you have the system of kings, you have a kind of a theocracy mediated by Moses before the Hebrews enter into the Promised Land. In in the New Testament, you have the Roman Empire, so a tyrant or an emperor from afar that's governing a distant province through his appointed officers. One thing you don't really see is democracy on any kind of a political level. That's what we have now. So there's a multitudinous problems. One is that if you talk to modern political conservatives, liberals, Christians, doesn't really matter who you talk to in the United States, people take democracy, they make an a priori assumption that it's good to have democracy, and the more people who are voting, the better. Contrast that with the beginning and end of the book of Judges, where you have everyone doing what's right in their own eyes. No, yeah, that's kind of a form of anarchy, but it's just the people ruling themselves. God has not told us that is. He's not prescribed that that's the system of government. That's the ideal system of government, that people just vote and 55% of people voted yay, 45 nay. So it's obvious that the moral or the correct, the wise decision is to do what the majority says. In the United States, we have a federal and Republican system of government. So in theory, states have some level of sovereignty, and we're also electing representatives as a republic who are the kind of people that would make the decisions that would best represent our values and our desires. We're not a direct democracy. What you hear commonly from people on the political left is the democracy over and over again, and it's kind of a red herring. It's anything that's non-democratic is supposed to be bad, except for when democratic decisions don't go their way, and then those are bad or manipulated, or there's some kinds of excuses. So all that to coming back to the 19th Amendment, to me, the idea of one household, one vote makes sense. I don't, from a biblical perspective, really have a problem if through death or tragedy there's a woman who becomes the head of her household, and not a young woman who's immature, but a wise older woman who's proved that she could rule over her household well under the authority of her husband, that she's raised kids who love and fear the Lord, who have turned out successful. Like, I don't see any reason why that type of woman would lose her ability to have a say just because she no longer has a husband in the household. Like she would be forced to remarry somebody so that they could, she could speak to her husband. And when we're talking about an ideal system where there isn't the franchise for everybody over the age of 18, regardless of sex. We're not talking about men who just ignore the counsel of their wives. We're talking about men who recognize that their wives have wisdom and are listening to them, but they're not being ruled by them. They're ruling well with wisdom. They're weighing pros and cons. And
okay, let me ask you a question. So do you think that the 19th Amendment made, secondarily maybe, or a downstream effect, so that it made men less responsible?
absolutely.
Like take on less responsibility? Because everyone had the same role, so like why is it my distinct?
I mean, yeah, I think you could even potentially, tie that into the recent effemination and emasculation of men in the 21st century.
Yeah. And just the blurring of what, men and women are in the first place. But when you tell women that they are just the same as men, when you have things like, they're like marriage is nothing, right? It's not a covenant. There's no fault divorce. When you have men and women both vote, there's no such thing as a head of household. When things like that happen, then it seems like you have things like men take on fewer responsibilities. They don't feel a responsibility for their family because it's all the same. I work, she works, the kids go here. We're all doing the same exact things. There's no difference in responsibility. And at the same time, it seems like women end up choosing probably worse men because there's like he's not ruling. He's not going to be the one really ruling over me. So what do I have to be worried about? I know it might be kind of a tenuous connection to say like, well, he can vote, I can vote. There's no distinction, but that's kind of the assumption, right? If there's no difference in what men and women do, like in the external world, why would there be any different or of how they interact or how they interface with the world? Why would there be any difference in their mind how their household is run or ruled?
There's less fusion of you as a couple too.
Yeah.
Because if you are allowed to, speak your mind through the ballot, then you're not really maybe coming together as a team to make decisions for the family, or at least that could be a symptom.
Or you're not a unit.
Yeah, you're not. It's the same thing if you have different bank accounts. You're not really a unit together as a family. So I think it's dangerous almost that you have a couple that would splinter off politically because that your worldview then is being exposed.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it's interesting. In practice, there would be a significant percentage of households where a husband and wife are both voting and they're just canceling each other's vote.
Right.
Which is really, it just doesn't make sense.
Because women, we know, more women vote more left and more men vote more right. And especially single women, right, vote more.
Well, ideally,
left.
you'd vote the same as a couple,
right?
A married couple.
Which you would think, ideally, like, as Christians, we're both going to vote the same. We have double vote, but our female Christian votes are overrun by non-Christian female votes or progressive females.
And I think that stat that you just referred to is probably changing.
Which one?
The one about females vote left, males vote right. I think that stat is probably changing to where now men are also voting liberal more so than in years past.
Oh.
Yeah.
I don't know. I guess it would depend on, I would have to look at that. It would have to be the issue, depend on the issue.
What I've heard, if you took out votes of women, the Republicans would have never lost a modern election. So
it's not like we love everything they do, but yeah.
I don't know if it's trending one way or the other, but
yeah, I think something I read like a year ago, especially with like Gen Zers, the younger generation of men are tending to vote more liberal.
Wow.
Yeah, and I think that I mean, Phil, you made a good distinction earlier about what I was saying, and then what you were saying about the covenant head. I think all of this really, you can tie it back to Genesis 3 in the garden after Adam and Eve sin, and God says, I will put enmity between you and the man. I mean, now as a result of that, I think it's just the natural state of men and women. Women are going to continually try to usurp men's authority. That's part of the curse.
Yeah.
And I think just
Definitely.
to be aware of that.
Well, a lot of female teachers dispute that. Shocking, right? When they see the term, and a woman will, what is it? Want? Her woman's desire will be for her husband.
Right.
And I misinterpreted that for a long time. I thought it just meant like
She'll love him a lot.
Right.
Right.
And I remember hearing a sermon where it was explaining, no, like she'll try to take over his role as the leader.
Right.
She'll try to. Yeah.
Right.
As Elliot said.
But it's really interesting because you do see so many female quote unquote, like, I don't want to say quote pastors because they don't even call themselves that, but like a lot of females in these teaching circles, like Christian teaching circles, that will start throwing in questions about that. Like, well, is that what it really means? Like, did they really?
like the serpent. Did God really say?
Yeah, it is interesting to me. And I'm not saying that is the final say, like just because you can question things and be valid in questioning them. But it is interesting to me that you see these same, I see like a lot of Christian feminism is just lagging, and it's like cloaked in different words than secular feminism. It's still trending the same direction, but it's pretending as if it's not.
Yeah, I don't even, I don't, my brain can't even compute the phrase
Christian feminism. I know. Yeah. But in what they would call the Christian sphere. But I've had some conversations with people about this, and people will draw a distinction that Phil doesn't, between, what happens in the home and what headship and leadership means, and what happens in the ecclesial sphere. So what happens in the church, and then what happens in the civil sphere. And they'll say, yes, in the church, men are supposed to lead. Most people don't even explain why. Like, oh, well, God just said. And I understand that the Christians requirement
they're almost apologetic
is to
about
obey. Yeah, it's like, yeah, right. When they're explaining what God, they don't say what God made man for. They said, this is a role and it's reserved for men. I don't really know why, but God says it, so we'll obey. Now, I'm glad that Christians are willing and want to obey, but it wasn't haphazard. It wasn't like, well, I'll just put the man here. And when I started, people will question, well, where does it say? Like, where does it say that in the civil sphere it should be led by men? I would argue that that's partially just an assumption. Like, it's assumed in Scripture that man will lead because you see that's who leads is men. And again, one of Phil's points is if correct me if I'm saying this wrong, but if families are led by men and all society is groups of families, then of course you're going to have male leadership within groups of families as well. But I saw Canon Press post this as well, talking about the three spheres: ecclesial sphere, the familial sphere, and then the civil sphere, why there's patriarchy, why there's father rule in each one of those. And it was referring to Isaiah 3, talking about woe to Israel. Verse 12 says, my people, their oppressors treat them violently, and women rule over them. My people, those who guide you, lead you astray and confuse the direction of your paths. So they're using this example of women ruling over as a negative. Am I reading that right? It's not a good thing. And women rule over them. It's like, and women rule over them.
Right.
It's like, it's assumed that wouldn't be the case. And it's interesting because I understand some of the argument where people will say, well, there are some exceptions. You do have some exceptions in Scripture where you have these female leaders. Mm-hmm. But my question for Christians in general is, are we trying to find what is descriptive, or are we trying to find what's prescriptive? Like, what is Scripture trying to tell us is the most fruitful, is the most beneficial, right, is going to lead to flourishing of all kind? And it doesn't seem like that happens
right
when you have female headship. Am I wrong?
No, I mean, and you're talking about what is the exception versus what is the rule.
Right.
Yeah. Sure. There's examples in Scripture of strong females that are in a leadership role, but again, it's never the rule. It's always the exception.
So what would we say then to women who do have very genuinely and obvious leadership qualities? is that a matter of where their leadership is exhibited? Is that like, how do you help a woman who has these traits and apparent giftings, and how do you not tell her, well, you're just not a leader? How do you put it in the right context?
I mean, scripturally, the Bible tells women to train other women, to train
Yeah.
younger women,
Yeah.
and guide them where they should go.
Yeah.
So I would argue that those skills are very well used in helping disciple younger women.
Do you think sometimes it could be overstated that some really conservative, maybe like the reformed camp of people, could overemphasize that it's male exclusive leadership in all areas?
So we're talking about civil.
It could be like a business.
Oh, yeah.
And let's say, I don't know, a family opens a business, or a woman's like, hey, I think I really want to open this business. Her husband's like, great.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many factors I think that you would have to consider. Like, does the husband already have a job? You know, is he already rooted in his own work and established in his own job, and this is just something that she wants to do, and he's just being supportive of that? Or is it like the husband's not working and it's
Yeah, no,
like,
I would say it's like a healthy situation overall.
Yeah.
He's working, she's industrious, she's entrepreneurial. Her kids aren't like 6 months. She's not like leaving them with anybody and just going off and doing her own thing. But
Yeah, that's I would be completely on board with that. And as a husband, if you know my wife ever wanted to do that, I think I would be supportive of that. Yeah, I don't, in that context, I don't see anything wrong with that.
I guess the question is, because people both love and hate really defined rules.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like, well, where's the line? And then when you draw the line, well, why's the line there? And it's like, well, is there a line? Like, is there a very clear line? I think that we would all agree there are certain lines, like, yeah, there's no such thing as female pastors.
Well,
okay, yeah.
Yeah, and that's kind of the point I was trying to make earlier with the slippery slope. You know, like I feel like, you know, you start out giving women the right to vote, and I think you've seen over time how that has led us to where we are today.
So how would we, if we went back in time, and obviously we can't perfectly, but how would we position ourselves currently to like stop that momentum? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, what could we have done in that scenario that would have stopped that from happening? What questions should we have been asking? What principles should we have been evaluating?
Well, I think Phil made a really good point of that earlier with just the covenantal, you know, heads being men and having those kinds of discussions.
So do you think the question is, why are women wanting that right? Are they not being led well? Could that be part of it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because when you have, I mean, you're always going to have women, not all women, but some women that are going to want that authority. But there's a large group of women that take it because their husbands aren't.
Right.
Do you know what I'm saying?
Right. Yes. So to answer your question, yeah, I do think that could be a component of it. Just men that aren't leading their families well and their wives well.
So how do you rectify that? Even now, like with weak men.
I mean,
Raising up your sons
One practical way is that the godly men who are ruling over churches, the elders of churches, need to get into people's homes and ask hard questions, things that might offend or hurt people, of the men, about the way that they're ruling their household, how they are shepherding their wives and discipling their children, because it all starts in the household. If the household is disintegrating, then the society will disintegrate. But if they're
What's
strong,
one can you think of like one offensive question that you're, because it's kind of vague?
like, do you ever read the Bible and pray with your family?
Okay.
I mean,
Yeah.
at its most basic level, you have a lot of men who love the Lord and have some kind of personal devotion life. Maybe they journal or pray by themselves and stuff, but their kids never see them reading the Bible. They don't read the Bible with their kids. They don't sing songs around the household. They don't really pray other than maybe thanking God for a meal. And so their family culture is bereft of their faith. It's built on other things. It's built on sports or on entertainment instead of building a thick culture of the love of the Lord, of His law, of the Word of God, of praise and worship. And I don't know where I heard it, but at some point, I think this was at the time of the Puritans in the early American years, the elders of churches would do regular visits, and if they found that a man wasn't leading some kind of family worship with his family, then they would try to work with him and train him, and if he abdicated it, they'd basically put him under church discipline and then kick him out of the church, because that's part of what it means to be a godly man who's ruling over your house.
Yeah, I think that's really practical.
Yeah. And I don't know the number of churches out there that practice what you're talking about, but I would venture to guess that it's not very many that actually
very
go
high.
around.
How much time and money do churches spend on children's programs and youth programs instead of pulling the men aside and training them to lead their own families?
Yeah.
And how much return on investment would it be if you did something to pull the men in once a month, and if all the men in your church were doing some kind of family worship, even if they did it 5 days a week, they didn't do it on the weekends, they just did it on the normal weekdays. They're up in the morning or in the evening. They read half a chapter of scripture with their kids, sing a song and say a prayer, but they did that every day, 360, they did it 5 days a week, every 12 months out of the year for 18 years of their kids' lives until they're at the point where they're graduating from high school. I mean, is that a better return on investment than youth camps and retreats and
the production value of your high school youth groups, worship? Yeah, and I think too, like, I've experienced it at other churches, but pastors in unhealthy churches wear a lot of hats. One example I can think of is a church that we used to go to. Our pastor was, speaking on the radio and, trying to do like outreach ministry. And, he was taking on all these different roles instead of just focusing on shepherding his flock and
equipping the saints for the work of ministry.
Yeah. Yeah. And instead of like focusing on shepherding his flock and doing exactly what Phil just mentioned, like going around to the homes of members in the church and checking in on them and seeing how the health of that family spiritually is going. So yeah, I think that's very practical, but I don't think you see a lot of churches whose pastors and elders take the time to do that.
We're thankful our church does that regularly. The last 2-3 years, they'll come in and check on us, pray with us, read the Bible with us, just make sure our family's doing well, ask for prayer requests, and it's really encouraging.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's not normal. So this kind of brings another thought into my head, and that was it's a broader topic, but it kind of corresponds with the 19th Amendment and whether or not women should be voting, etc. I was interacting with a quote pastor lady pastor, whatever you want to call it, on X.
Just a lady,
a lady
not
who
a
said who said she was a pastor. Yeah, it was weird. Anyway, so I had responded to I think it's still called a tweet, even though it's on X. But I was responding to a tweet that A.D. Robles had posted, and this is what I said. I said I would happily give up my vote if that meant every other, like all women lost their vote. Like I that's fine. First of all, I just got to say, we have too much to do. Females already have so many responsibilities. Why do I want more? Why do I want to find a job outside of the house? Why do I want to figure out who to vote for, what to vote for, all these different propositions to vote for? Like, I don't have the time to do it well and do everything else well. Mm-hmm. Like I'm trying to bake bread and make kombucha, and like I don't want to vote. I'd happily give it away. And I had these kind of flood of women respond to me like, well, you can give up your vote, but you're not giving up ours. Like I could really do that in the first place. Women, it was just showing itself for how sensitive women are and how much they shouldn't vote anyway. But anyway, the one woman said something about being a pastor or something like that. And something to the effect of, you can't give up our vote and what we've worked so hard for, or blah, blah, blah. And I know she doesn't do anything, and I said, oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know I was talking to I put quote female, and then I put quote female, end quote, and then pastor. And she said, I am a female pastor. Do I need to show you my, what is it called? Ordination? Yeah. Do I need to show you my ordination? And she went on in her history. I was like, oh, I'm sorry. I meant to put the quotes around pastor, not female. And then she went off again and she said all this stuff. And I was like, okay, I'm going to stop being sarcastic with you, because I think there's a time for sarcasm and a time not for sarcasm, and it just wasn't going anywhere. I said, the reason why I don't think women can vote, or women should vote, is exemplified exactly in the way that you're responding to a random person on Twitter or X. Over emotionally, cannot contain yourself, and obviously can't take a joke, like has to insist that you're like, I was telling Phil, what male pastor can you think of that you would say, oh, you're not, you can't be a pastor, you're a male, would get upset? They would just be like, okay. You know what I mean? Yeah. But it's the female pastors that are getting like all up in arms. Okay, going back to the original tweet, I believe that AD was posting this because of the larger debate on X about Christian nationalism. And so, like Phil said, there is kind of this sacred, or this idol of secular liberalism, democracy, that is being protected by so many people, even Christians. It's like, no. We're not saying that we want a Christian prince, or we're not saying we want a Christian nation. We don't want a Christian government. That's never going to happen. And my question just keeps being to all these people who are fighting about this and saying they don't want to. My question is, why not? Like, wouldn't a Christian want Christian things for other people because it gives blessings to people?
Well, none of these people disagree that we want to see more people become Christians and follow the Lord and worship Him. And yet they don't understand how, well, if we go from 10 or 20% people who are sincere and really practicing biblical Christianity to 80%, like, what, that's not going to impact the politics.
Right.
Of course they're going to vote as Christians. Well, you would hope, if they're properly discipled.
And the president is a Christian, and the senators are going to be senators as Christians. They're not going to leave their faith at the door.
It's an absurd statement when people say to leave your faith at the door, or leave your beliefs. Like, literally no one does that. An atheist doesn't do that.
Right.
So,
well, and I think that's another pervasive, I think,
myth.
Yeah. Well, is that there's got to be this separation of church and state, because in an idyllic society there would be no distinction.
Well,
like in an idyllic Christian society.
Well, I would say there would be a separation between the civil sphere and the church sphere. There should be, because we're not sacralists, right? We don't think that one governs the other, or vice versa, right?
Yeah,
church. But we don't think there's a division in your person between what you believe and how you interact.
Yeah, that's a better distinction to make. Yeah.
The organization or the entity of the state bears the sword to be God's revenger.
Avenger, right? Or revenger.
Revenger.
Oh, yeah.
Avenger, yeah. To lift up those who do good and to punish those who do evil. The church bears the keys of the kingdom to excommunicate people. The parents bear the rod of discipline to discipline their own children and raise them in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Mm-hmm. So each sphere has its own symbol, the rod, the keys, the sword. Mm-hmm. And so if you have the parents or the church bearing the sword, you're going to be in trouble.
Right.
Which it did.
Mix it up however you want.
Yeah, and there was mixing. Yeah, of that. Which is why I see over time, faithful Christians have begun to see how biblical principles work themselves out in every sphere. and that there are things that God has already foreordained that they don't mix together. But it's interesting because these principles have to be worked out in a very pragmatic way, which is, it is a real problem because there are some questions that really can't be answered about what a Christian nation would look like long term until you actually get to that point. So I don't know if you remember any questions, Phil, but there could be questions like, what do you do, like on Sundays? Do we close the roads, or for a Sabbath day? And it's like, I don't really know. I don't know what that would look like on Sundays. Should everyone be compelled to shut everything down and have Sabbath? I really don't know. There are some questions, pragmatic questions, but I think the stage that we're in right now would be asking, well, what is God's standard for the state? Because I think people are at least more clear on what his standard is for the church, and more so, and what his standard is for the family. But people seem to take a third, like, neutral way when it comes to civil sphere. They're like, oh, okay, well, the state is its own thing. Like, we can't really move in on that. And I wonder if that's just because of the constant indoctrination since we are raised, that there is that distinction between
that's kind of what I was
sacred.
Trying to touch on earlier. Like, are Christians apprehensive about going into that sphere because of that distinction and what we've been taught growing up? Yeah.
And I think, there's prudence to be careful about, okay, the Baptists keep bringing this up, right? Like, if we go back to how things operated when there was a lot of blurring between church and state, then the Baptists are going to be killed. And that's what now all these Presbyterians that are pushing for Christian nationalism.
Mostly just flogged, not killed, but some were killed.
Okay, yeah, okay, flogged. The Baptists are going to be flogged. And I think that we can look back as Christians and say, yeah, that was a sinful use of that faux authority, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
Can we agree on that? But to say, so I've heard Christians say that, well, I don't want to go back to that. Well, that's not really what's being proposed. What's being proposed is that the law of God is good, and that we should seek that the law of God would rule us and our nation. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
Mostly? So when people say, I don't want to go back to that, I'm like, okay, what's the alternative? Then what are you proposing? Do we stay? Because, yes, we have kind of sanitized our type of murder, right? Abortion being the number one cause of death in our nation. We've sanitized it so it looks like we've called it just, medical necessity or a medical choice or whatever. And so it's cleaner. No one sees the blood. And so people are more okay with it because you don't see the blood. But it's actually, you're killing more people, and it's more vicious, and it's more disgusting than probably, any other example that people have used against this. So my question is, again, like, by what standard? Why do we choose democracy over God's law?
Yeah. So I was just looking this up, but Phil was talking about earlier, a republic or democracy. I think why it would be so hard for people to give that up now is because of the idea of losing this hyper individualistic society that we've become. Because you would have to be more cohesive in a society that's something the opposite of a democracy or a republic. You'd have to be cohesive. It couldn't just be about you. Especially in the Christian context, it's not about the individual. It's about the family, and then the community of families, and then beyond that. So you're losing that hyper individuality, I think, if you give that up.
Yeah, I think people assume that because they have like a vote or
Yeah.
they're their own person, that they have some sense of power or authority, which is kind of funny and laughable because they have like nothing,
That's why I think you have these like fifth wave feminists now that are like hyper individualistic, is because of being given that right to vote in the 19th Amendment,
Do you think
it is a fallacy,
What part?
just that
You think that so you are an individual,
right,
and you're
that is a fallacy.
Yeah, you're an individual. You go into the kingdom of God as an individual, but the process of going there, you're actually with the saints
Right.
on your way. So yeah, I guess I never really thought of it like that. Like if you gave that up, you are basically. It's funny because people are already so tribal, but they don't really want to. At the same time, they don't want the submission aspect of a tribe, that comes with a tribe or a family. It's like, oh yeah, this is my family, but I do exactly what I want to do, which is definitely not biblical. There are some things that I don't agree with from any church that I've been a part of. There are things that Phil thinks that, and it's pretty rare, but there are things that Phil thinks that I'm like, I don't really think about that I have to choose. Like, am I going to hold on to what I think is right, or am I going to submit to this because this is the interesting thing with women in particular is that women have this wonderful gift of being able to choose who leads them. Like, you didn't have to say yes to anybody. You just had to say yes to one person.
Yeah, and I think our society as a whole has a huge problem with the word submit.
Well, for sure.
Why
would I lower myself?
Right, exactly.
Because people see it synonymous with abuse, and there is real abuse.
Yeah.
And I think it would be wrong, it would be disadvantageous if we didn't actually acknowledge that there is real abuse, right? And at the same time, to lump everything in as abuse is also wrong.
And historically, there have been cases where men have abused their authority.
Absolutely.
Right. So, and you can see that clearly in history. Not that is a good enough reason to not want to submit to your husband.
Yeah.
But there is that aspect of it as well.
I guess as far as abuse, I would, to put a bow on our conversation, if it's true that forms of civil government throughout recorded history where it has only been men that are in charge have resulted in abuse or oppression of women, does that necessarily mean, does it logically follow that you must allow women into the political sphere and that will solve the problem? It doesn't logically follow. It could be the case, theoretically, if you apply a biblical framework. You'll see the wisdom of not allowing women as a rule into that sphere. And then if you wanted to look at the evidence, well, what fruit is there over the last 100 years of liberal Western democracies where women have entered in? So the military is a little bit of a microcosm, but so bear with me while I draw this analogy. So one of the main reasons why there was an anti-suffrage movement was that women didn't want the responsibilities that came along with the privilege of voting. And so, Elliot, you and I both registered for the Selective Service when we turned 18, and our wives did not, because we are men and they are women. And if there was a draft, we could be called up and they would not be. And so you have women who have the right to vote to send men to die on foreign beaches, foreign deserts, but they will never they'll bear the cost, like Hillary Clinton said, and that they'll lose their husbands, their brothers, their sons, whatever, but they're not going to lose their own lives. They're not going to experience the trauma, the post-traumatic stress disorder, whatever, of being in combat for that. And it's one of the reasons why I would oppose women in the military is because largely women are not sent into combat roles, but if you have a woman colonel or a woman general or a woman admiral who's sending men into combat to certain death, but she will never face that in the typical exercising of her duties, she's going to be sending people to die, but will never, and throughout her entire career has never been in that. Whereas a male general, may very well have been in that position as a first lieutenant or a major in a combat zone in the front lines. And so it seems just unjust and unwise that you would put women in the position to vote other people to bear the price that they would never have to bear. And honestly, if you're talking about a democratic type society, if you had a society where if you voted to go to war, then you would be you would have a privileged position in the draft, that you'd be more likely to be chosen. I would be in favor of that. The more hawkish you are, the more likely you're going to be over there and bear the consequences of your own vote. And so what if you're 60 years old? You can go over there. You don't get the right to just sit there and vote the young men to go over and die because you're too old now to do it.
Well, what if you had served before?
Yeah, if you've served before, that's another
That
thing.
extends to a lot of areas when it comes to voting. Like if you have nothing to lose, you're going to make very selfish and self-serving decisions. To which I would say we should restrict the vote even further to people who are paying taxes and
Service guarantees citizenship. Robert Heinlein, Starship Troopers. If you're not familiar with that.
Yeah, I do think you have to have some sort of skin in the game. Yeah, to vote, because if you don't, then you lack experience or the knowledge.
that too. Yeah.
Well, I'll just, okay, let me bring this up though, because some women will listen to this and they'll say, yeah, all sounds good. Okay, great. But what if you have women that are like being abused? What do you do in those situations? And is the church doing it? Like, how do you protect those women from not being overrun by their husbands and men?
The church should be involved in stopping that, as well as the law of the land should not allow that to be happening.
Right.
And women should, I would hope, want to protect themselves and their children by getting out of that situation. But I'm not.
Yeah, are we talking about specifically within the church or just in society in general?
I think I would say more so in the church, because the church should has a.
So, and I think that also just comes back to Phil's point earlier, that if pastors and elders are really doing their due diligence and
that's a good point.
and investing in the home and making sure that these members' houses are in order, like from a spiritual standpoint, that would solve a lot of those abuse issues, because then they could, they could speak into that or set up some sort of a support system for that woman who's being abused.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What is the story in the Bible of the sister getting raped and the brothers going and
Tamar.
killing him?
Tamar.
And who raped her? Wasn't it her half brother?
It's Dinah.
Dinah.
Well, there's a couple, unfortunately, stories.
Tamar was slept with her father-in-law.
Oh yeah.
Another.
I'm telling you,
Another-
another Tamar that got raped.
It's Dinah.
So yes, okay. So Dinah gets raped by her half brother, right?
No, by
It's by a random
by
guy.
a Canaanite.
Oh,
And
Canaanite.
then
Wonder
her
if he was a
brothers-
giant.
Og.
Og. Wonder if it was
I'm
Og.
just
They
plugging
promised
Han
that
and
she'll
Cosmos on here.
marry the man that raped her if their whole village is circumcised, and while those men are recovering from being circumcised, the brothers
Looks
come
like
and
my
kill
my
them.
wife might want to make a
Brutal.
point.
Oh, go ahead.
Tamar is raped by her half brother Amnon, while her
It's
father
a different
became
Tamar.
Yeah, we're right. She
Well,
said there was
because-
another Tamar.
Oh yeah.
Kudos to Tori.
I'm gonna get a little off topic here
That was
because
the half brother I was thinking of then.
I want to come back to something you said
David's
earlier,
family, total chaos.
Danae.
But I brought it. Okay, can you remember it? Because I want to
yeah,
say
yeah,
why
I'll
I
remember
said
it.
that.
Yeah.
So the reason I brought it up is because if you have families that are actually with each other, brothers serve an excellent there's not just one man in a family.
Right.
Typically, there are other males involved who really care about the well-being of their sister. If the dad's not caring, which the dad primarily should care, there shouldn't just be one person in your life. Like you shouldn't be secluded from community at all. Like you need to be with people.
Yeah.
Go on.
So I just thought of this, but you mentioned earlier about as a woman, like I've got so much to take care of. Like how could I possibly think about
Vote.
going out and voting?
Yeah.
And for a lot of women that's true, especially for women that are raising children in the house and they're taking care of other obligations. But so what would you say then to a woman who's single, maybe can't bear children or just has Paul's gift of singleness, but they're
Celibacy.
they're freed up to to
Do those
vote,
things.
to do those things.
So I do think there's I guess there's a distinction, because if there's a woman who's basically in preparation for marriage, like she's young and she's probably going to get married, because most young women end up getting married, that she should be practicing and cultivating those domestic skills. So she's not practicing and cultivating them after she's married. So she still has a lot to do. There's like a lot of women should be doing a lot more preparation for marriage than just trying to look prettier and getting their hair done.
I did nothing.
Correct.
So,
Ditto.
just for your listeners and for me, can you give us an example of what are those things you would?
Yeah, you have free time. You go home. You learn how to make a big pot of soup that can feed like 15 people, and you like nail it down. You learn how to pressure can. Oh, I'm pressure canning chicken stock. Now I'm pressure canning soups. Now I'm pressure canning beans. Oh, now I'm starting a garden. Okay, so I'm going to learn how to grow peas. Oh, I'm going to learn how to grow cauliflower. I mean, literally, even if you just gardened, you could never run out of things to do.
Learn how to sew, learn how to tend for chickens, learn
how to
basic first aid,
lots of
nursing,
yes, that's a good
light nursing
one.
skills.
Learn how to take care of young children when they're sick. So you're the person that's like, hey, older mom in my church, can you invite me over when like your kids are sick? I kind of want to figure out how to, and this is incumbent upon older moms too, to invite younger women into their home. But let's say it's a woman who is not getting married. They're still mothers. They can still mother, right? They're still spiritual mothers. They're still people that care for, like, when you are sick, do you ever get a card from your grandpa? No one ever gets a card from their grandpa, but they get a card from their grandma.
Or if you're
she
sick,
is in what?
If you're sick as a man, do you ever think of having another man come over and take care of you?
You're a little boy, you're 7 years old and you're sick. Is it your grandpa that's writing you notes? No, it's always an old woman in the church that's like, you know what? I have a lot of time. I'm going to use it to mother somebody. I am going to write them a sweet note. I'm going to drop off bread at their doorstep. I am going to maternal, wonderful, womanly things, the things that only women do, and almost exclusively all women do this. And so I guess that's what I would say. For all women are mothers in some way. Okay, what are you have something out?
Yeah, I had a thought just on if men are going to be abusive, what do we do? So
Good.
You kind of have options, right? You can take that. Well, what you should be doing is taking that reality and trying to apply wisdom to it. And so the question is, how do we apply biblical wisdom in the situation? Do we go towards overturning the biblical order and allowing men to abdicate responsibility to lead and invite women into that sphere? Or do we look to biblical wisdom to put in appropriate guardrails while also encouraging women in submitting? And so it reminded me of what Peter writes. So he writes in to not let your adorning be external, blah, blah, blah. This is how holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children, if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. So I think that's the hard word that modern women need to hear, is that you will adorn yourself by figuring out how to submit to your own husband in the godly and appropriate ways. You will do good if you learn to fear God instead of fearing everything else around you. It's like, I'm afraid that if I don't have this power to vote, if I don't have this authority over my husband, or if I don't have this position of leadership, that I'm going to be abused. I mean, Sarah was abused. Abraham did not treat her well in all circumstances recorded in the Bible. He took her suggestion to have sex with Hagar and had a son that was not from his wife. He lied twice about her being his sister instead of his wife and put her in a precarious position. And so he did not love or rule over her, but she adorned herself by entrusting herself to God and by not living in fear. So that's the biblical encouragement, or the biblical word to these women, is instead of fearing and grasping for power and authority and subverting the biblical order that God has ordained, look for ways to submit to your husband, to submit to God, and learn how to not be governed by your fears. Now, that's not to say that there's not a wisdom to apply that might, it's not like simple. There are gray areas, but that's the general rule. And I think we've swung really far away and allowed women to live in fear. And by operating out of that fear, they have grasped this authority that they were never intended by God to grasp.
Mm-hmm. That's good.
I guess it does kind of make me nervous to hear that, because there's always going to be circumstances where it like passes that limit of like the answer would be get out. Do you know what I'm saying?
I mean, you have to entrust yourself to the one who judges justly.
Right.
Like, Christ put himself in the hands of God, and he's our example. And women have this unique calling to put themselves in the hands of fallible a man, and in our culture, it's a man of their own choosing,
Right.
to lead them.
And ultimately,
But it's scary.
it is scary. But ultimately, you're submitting to the Lord, and that man is going to have to
It's to give an account.
Answer. He has to answer.
to the Lord.
And he has to answer to the civil government if he commits a crime against his wife, and he has to answer
To the church.
to the church if he
Hopefully, yeah.
if he sins against his wife and won't repent of it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think that answers it. But I think that we have infantilized women in a lot of ways. Like, oh, you can't handle the hard things. Like, I even remember this when I first had Asher and thinking, I've been home all day doing this. You come home, act like my job's not hard. Think of how much I've suffered. And it's the martyr syndrome, of like, poor me, woe was me. And it's like, hey, can you do hard things? Then do it, and you don't have to tell everyone about it. You don't have to post on Facebook. You don't got to tell people how hard your day was. Just do hard things and enjoy the process of growing in the Lord. That's something obviously we're trying to teach our kids, and I've seen it's if you want your kids to be able to do hard things, like even work on their handwriting, which is like a big struggle sometimes, then you better be able to do hard things in front of them and show them that when things are hard, you still will push through. So anyway, that's good. Any other thoughts? I have a question, but I'm going to ask you guys after we stop recording. Dun, dun, dun. All right, my final button. I think that's a good ending.
Nice.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.